Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching Ibn Battuta Part 5, Plague and Homecoming by Extra History. This is the last episode in their series on Ibn Battuta. Now last time we saw as he managed to escape the Mad Sultan of Delhi, traveling wide and far once again, gaining and losing several fortunes along the way, and eventually ending up in China. Today we'll get to see what he gets up to in China and how his journey ends. Now, at the end of all these extra history series, they do an episode where they go over everything they missed throughout the original episodes. I'll have my reaction to that listed in the description down below and pinned in the comments section. That will be a channel members exclusive. So if you want to see that, you can become a YouTube channel member by hitting that join button next to the subscribe button. So with that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
1346, Xuanzhou, China. Ibn Battuta found China a land of wonders, an upside-down place where people used paper instead of coin, and even beggars wore silk.
I'm sure. I mean, we've talked about how this is the furthest afield Ibn Battuta has been from home, right? He is now out of the Islamic world, seeing a totally different culture, way of life, different practices, right? This is going to be quite unfamiliar to him. And of course, China is this very long-standing, very prosperous kingdom. So there's certainly a lot to see, a lot of new things here to see for Ibn Battuta, who has already seen quite a lot through his travels.
China was beautiful, he wrote, but it did not please me.
Oh.
Because while Ibn Battuta had traveled widely, most of the communities he visited were Muslim or Muslim ruled, and he rarely ventured outside that bubble. Where minority religions existed, they were at least other monotheists.
Yeah, Ibn Battuta mostly has traveled in kingdoms ruled over by Muslims. Sometimes he's been in areas that have been a little more diverse, but they did tend to be still Islamic states with some Christians and Jews. And he's been to the occasional sort of non-majority Muslim place like Constantinople, but I guess even then, still pretty adjacent to the Muslim world and still other monotheistic religions, so still stuff that he was pretty familiar and comfortable with. This is definitely, like I said, very far afield from what he's familiar with.
Like Christians or Jews. The Chinese, by contrast, were polytheistic and worshipped what Ibn Battuta considered idols. Confucian scholars were dismissive of Islam, and the population ate pork and cremated their dead. This disturbed me so much.
Right, obviously, I think it's a good thing to travel and see new things, but I suppose if you're an intensely religious person, something like this might make you uncomfortable. Also shows you some of that bond between the sort of big three monotheistic religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, who often have fights, both sort of literal and figurative, among each other, but there is often some sort of solidarity between the three, the sort of people of the book, you could call them, where they see some sort of solidarity among themselves when it comes to other sort of polytheistic religions.
He wrote that I stayed indoors most of the time and only went out when necessary.
Wow.
During my stay in China, whenever I saw Muslims, I always felt as though I were meeting my own family and close kinsmen. Perhaps it was time to go home. But when he did so, death followed him.
What the hell? That didn't sound good.
Ibn Battuta didn't have to look far to find other Muslims in Yuan, China. Indeed, for over a century, the Mongol Yuan had kept an open-door policy that invited foreigners to settle and form trading villages.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this last time, right? This is, of course, a non-Muslim ruled state, and, certainly not even close to Muslim majority, but it's not like there's no Muslims there. You've got Muslim traders and travelers, right? So Ibn Battuta isn't totally alone in that, right? It's a very diverse population here, doing a lot of international trade. You'll find all types of different people.
While in these Islamic enclaves, he even ran into other scholars he'd met during his travels.
Huh.
Because as you've probably understood by now, Ibn Battuta was not an explorer. During his travels, he'd made his way along well-known pilgrimage and trade routes. The Mongol conquest and the peace and security that they'd created had fostered an unprecedented network of overland and maritime trade routes.
Yeah, I guess that's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it like that. He's not an explorer, he's a traveler. And a traveler who wants to make a lot of money as he goes. He's traveling a lot of fairly well-trod paths, It just happens that he traveled more than anybody else. He's not usually forging new roads ahead, he's taking pretty well-traveled routes.
Few people traveled to the extent that Ibn Battuta did,
Right.
but he was far from the only person to journey from Africa to East Asia.
Hmm.
In China, he met Syrians, Egyptians, and even a man who grew up 40 miles from him back in Morocco.
Wow, now how about that? Sort of a hometown friend. Yeah, I guess what sets Ibn Battuta apart is maybe, I don't know if you'd call it curiosity or simply getting distracted, is the amount of side quests that this guy goes on. He's got one route in mind, but he makes so many detours along the way. That's what's really racking up all the miles that he has traveled.
Because you see, the world of the mid 14th century was an interconnected world,
Mhm.
one where goods and people could go from one side of Africa and Eurasia to the other. And
Yeah, I mean, I've absolutely made this point through the series that, of course, we look around at our world today and it is more globalized than ever, but that sort of gives some people a misconception that you look back throughout history and you feel like, oh, it wasn't an interconnected or globalized world. But that's not true, right? There were plenty of international trade and travel routes, as we've seen through the experience of Ibn Battuta, plenty of people traveling through these lands, especially if you had some uniting factor, like religion, for example. You had lots of trade and travel through the Islamic world, even beyond, sort of going through the Silk Road, lots of trade all the way east from China, say, all the way through the Western world, through these European countries, right? So there's a lot of, communication, travel, trade between these three continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, right? It's very interconnected.
that would ultimately destroy this period of peace and interchange.
Yeah.
Because in Central Asia, a terrible disease was emerging. A disease that caused painful buboes on the body, extreme headaches, and delirium. An even more aggressive form, the airborne pneumatic variety, caused victims to cough blood and killed within hours.
Mm.
It was a disease born by fleas. Fleas that lived on rats, an animal that liked to infest ships or stow away on caravans and wagons. In other words, an insect that infested all modes of transport Ibn Battuta had taken on his long road.
Yeah.
When he boarded his ship back to India, he had no idea that he was seeing the last days of Yuan China. Bubonic plague would lead to the dynasty's collapse and sow chaos on the peaceful trade roads of the four Mongol kingdoms.
Yeah, and they're exactly right to tie how interconnected this world was to the spread of the Black Plague, right? Because it's going to decimate essentially all of these lands that we've talked about, some worse than others, but very terrible for all. Of course, you can think it makes its way all the way to Europe, absolutely decimates Europe, decimates a lot of the places we've already seen through this series. So this is one of those times when how interconnected everything is has sort of horrible consequences.
Indeed, Ibn Battuta would begin to see that collapse himself. He retraced his route to India and considered going.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't take long for the consequences to begin to reveal themselves, right? The next couple of years, the Black Death is going to wreak havoc, crashing economies and societies and states just about everywhere you look.
back to Delhi. But word reached him that the Sultanate was tearing itself apart, and Ibn Battuta was worried that the Sultan would execute him for his failed mission.
Fair.
So he made another plan. A little, what is that thing called? Oh yeah, a side trip
Yep.
to Mecca to make the Hajj one last time.
Classic.
But by
That's how he started, right? All of his travels, his journeys started with him making the Hajj, going to Mecca.
the time he made it to the Arabian Peninsula, the pilgrimage season had ended. He would need to wait a year before it started again. So, rather than just hang out, he took another separate side trip. A side trip, revisiting Persia, Iraq, Syria, and Egypt to see how things had changed in the
How
time he'd
about
been away.
that? Now he's retraveling over well-trodden roads he saw years before.
And he was shocked at what he found. The great Ilkhan, the man he'd traveled with, was dead, likely from plague. He'd left an empty throne, several ongoing wars, and his Mongol and Turkish generals were ripping the land apart in a series of succession conflicts.
Yeah.
It was the first dark cloud in what would be a storm of sadness.
I think I mentioned this when we first spotted the Ilkhanate a couple episodes ago, that they talked about how prosperous and stable it was. And I was like, not for much longer. It's got a couple years to go.
He arrived in Damascus to find that the son he'd left behind, with one of his many ex-wives, had died in childhood,
Mm,
and a separate message told him that his father had passed away 15 years before.
damn.
Saddened, he took a
Imagine that. 15 years before. Your father has passed away 15 years ago. You don't even know about it. Or to put it another way, your dad passes away, you don't find out for 15 whole years. That's crazy. I mean, look, traveling so far afield, I guess you sort of have to accept that you don't know who's going to be there when you get back. Of your friends and family members, you don't know who's going to remain. But that's crazy.
trip to Aleppo. But as he traveled, a great curtain was being pulled across Syria.
Hmm.
The Black Plague descended on the Middle East, chasing him on the road. He fled back to Damascus, but found the oasis city ground to a halt, with 2,000 dying every day and the
Jesus.
populace in terror. As in Europe, the Islamic world believed the disease came from a religious rather than medical source. But
Mm.
while Christian Europe interpreted it as punishment for human sin and greeted the plague with apocalyptic sermons, self flagellation, and massacres of their Jewish neighbors,
Yeah, it was a real weird time. You know what I mean? And to be honest, it's not incredibly surprising that was the response when you have a plague that kills a third to a half of the population, depending on where you are. You know, keep that in mind. That means of every three people you know, you're going to lose one or, you know, one basically. Or every four people, two. But I'll stick with the every three people. You know, not to get too morbid, but you can imagine every three people you know, your friends, your family, everyone you know in your life, you're losing one of those three, perhaps more. That's extremely traumatic. When that happens to a society, what society can deal with that, really? The society is either going to fall apart or it's going to resort to rather radical measures, which happen to be these apocalyptic predictions, people, believing that they're being punished, things like self-flagellation, a lot of strange religious practices, massacres of, minority and other populations like Jewish minorities, right? So it leads to all of these events just due to the immense death caused by this plague.
Islamic cities looked on it as a manifestation of the divine will. To them, it was an aspect of God's unknowable plan that must simply be endured with humility. Ibn Battuta saw the residents of Damascus fast for 3 days, followed by a packed day of prayer and supplication in the mosque. Afterward, the multi-ethnic populace paraded through the city
Hmm.
streets together, holding aloft copies of their holy texts. Muslims carried
Hey,
the
there's that sort of monotheistic solidarity once again. People of the book.
Quran, Christians the Bible, and Jews the Torah, all with tears, imploring their God to stop the suffering. Damascus would
Yeah.
lose more than 30,000 citizens to the disease, its streets choked with funeral parades, corpses left uncovered due to the city running out of burial shrouds. Ibn Battuta fled to Cairo, passing empty villages and bodies along the road. And when he arrived, he found the great city, with a population of 500,000, deserted by its leaders and losing 24,000 residents each day.
Damn.
Plague would eventually kill 200,000, including most of the army officers, sending the Mamluk Sultanate into decline. But in 1348, the worst year of the plague, Ibn Battuta made it to Mecca and
Hmm.
fulfilled his goal of making the Hajj one last time.
Yeah, I guess under these conditions, it might have felt even more important to make that pilgrimage. I mean, maybe for some it shook their faith, but as we've seen in such a religious world, whether we're talking about Islam or Christianity, people tended to interpret these events through a religious worldview, and so it only sort of strengthened their faith, though it could lead it in sort of strange directions. So I guess for Ibn Battuta, sort of more important a time than ever to make that pilgrimage.
It must have made him think of his first pilgrimage when he left Tangier at the age of 21, freshly graduated and never having left home.
Wow.
Now, he was a 45-year-old man. I was moved by memory.
Hey, you know what? You've done all that traveling, seen everything you've seen, gone to all those places, and you've survived for that long. That's pretty impressive.
Of my homeland, he wrote. Affection for my family and dear friends who drew me toward my land, which in my opinion was better than any other country. Yet when he arrived home in Tangier, he found his mother had died of plague as well.
Mm.
And days later, he was on the road again. At a loss for what to do, he volunteered as a soldier to defend the Rock of Gibraltar from a Spanish siege,
Wow.
but arrived to find the battle already over. Instead, he toured Muslim Spain.
This man will really do anything. He just shows up, any sort of job. I could be a soldier. I could do anything. This man really making cameos wherever he goes. I think I've already made this comparison. Very sort of Forrest Gump-esque story.
Before returning home. But that was not the end of his journey. The Sultan of Morocco, hearing of his voyages, appointed him ambassador to the Golden Empire of Mali.
Ooh.
Though that's a tale you'll have to hear about over in our Empire of Mali series.
Oh my goodness.
Because this dude went everywhere.
Ibn Battuta now has popped up in, I believe, 2 other extra history series. Like I said, Forrest Gump. This man, if you're talking about the sort of Islamic history of this era, basically wherever you're talking about, this guy's gonna pop up.
And when he returned, the Sultan gave Ibn Battuta a new command to dictate his story to the third Ibn Juzay, so that there could be a record of all he saw in the Muslim world.
Thank God for that. You know what I mean? I'm glad we have this very important source.
Result was not a perfect book. Ibn Battuta worked from memory, and as a result, got details wrong, misremembered dates, and mixed up some events.
Sure.
Someone, either Ibn Battuta himself or Ibn Juzay, decided to fill in the blanks by copying sections of other travel books, even inventing some.
Yeah, I mean, look, we see this with a lot of these grand explorers over time. Some are frankly more dishonest than others. But when you're dictating or writing from memory, you're gonna get a lot of stuff wrong. And either, usually, whoever's writing or whoever's editing or whatever will embellish. And that's how a lot of history pre the modern era was done. A lot of embellishment, a lot of made up stories, right? So, I can yap about sources for hours. I've talked a lot about sourcing throughout this channel. We got to be very careful when we're using these primary sources. We need corroboration from other sources. You need to understand who's doing the writing, who they're writing for, what's their audience, why are they writing this, right? But with all that, still a very important source, of course.
Journeys, so the book would be a full compendium of the whole Muslim world. For instance, Ibn Battuta likely never made it out of southern China, nor did he travel far north into Russia as the book claims. And Rob will talk about how we know that in our Lies episode. But despite all these issues, The Travels is an extraordinary document. One that, despite its contradictions, exaggerations, and occasionally confused timelines, gives historians an unprecedented look at the Muslim world of the 14th century and how its trade networks operated. Given that, it's almost anticlimactic to say that when they were originally published, they received little attention.
Damn.
In fact, Ibn Battuta's fellow judges often called him an uneducated liar. We know almost nothing about the rest of his life.
Yeah, I mean, can you really blame them? They're reading this book and they're like, there's no shot he did even half of this. Like, come on, man. You're gonna make all this up? He's like, no, I actually did most of this, not all. It's pretty unbelievable, though.
That he likely settled down as a mid-level Qadi, probably married again, if precedent had anything to say about it, and died without fanfare. It's ironic, then, that today, Ibn Battuta's personal fame eclipses any of the rulers and even some of the kingdoms he visited. While few people around the world have heard of the Ilkhanate or Mohammed Tughlaq, Ibn Battuta's life has been the subject of television dramas, movies, and even video games. You can visit Ibn Battuta Mall in Dubai, where the different sections are themed to his journeys. Fly into Tangier, and you'll land in Ibn Battuta.
It's the most Dubai thing I've ever heard.
Airport. Eat at Ibn Battuta restaurants, visit an Ibn Battuta festival, and even see an unmarked tomb that's said to be his final resting place. He even has a crater on the moon. I have indeed. Praise be to God, attained my desire in this world.
I'm sure he would have liked all that.
He wrote, which was to travel through the earth, and I have attained in this respect what no other person has attained to my knowledge. Happy travels, friends. See you next time.
Alrighty. It's the end of their series on Ibn Battuta. They mentioned the Lies episode there at the end, as I talked about in the introduction. If you'd like to see my reaction to that, it'll be linked either in the description or pinned in the comments section. It'll be for channel members exclusively. So you want to watch that? Become a YouTube channel member. You can hit the join button next to the subscribe button. So the end of their series on Ibn Battuta, a great traveler, went on this incredible journey throughout the Islamic world. Of course, there's a lot to be said about him individually. He was certainly an impressive character, though quite prickly at times, but it does seem like, especially if you're considering this more through the history or sort of academically, you could say the real value from his life and story is that through it you can really analyze the Islamic world of that era and especially analyze the connections throughout the Islamic world, the trade routes, communication routes, which are often the same thing through the Muslim world at this point, which is very, very valuable, right? So his life really gives you a lot of good lessons in the history of that era. So really fascinating stuff. I had heard of Ibn Battuta before this series, but all I knew was the headline, right? This great traveler. Now I certainly know a lot more. So I enjoyed this one. If you guys did, appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, become a channel member once again. With that, hope you guys are having a great day today, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.